My name is Ricardo Corrales. I am a master's student at the University of Costa Rica, and today I will present my research titled "A Review of Gender Bias Mitigation in Credit Scoring Models." So, as an introduction, let's talk a little bit first about, credit scoring. This is some kind of numerical tools that has been in use, has had a significant impact in the financial industry since the 1960s. These kind of tools are used to evaluate borrowers by the loaners in order to mitigate the possibility or the impact of the risk of this borrower not paying their loan back. And so starting more or less in the 1980s, these kind of credit scoring models have been using mathematical models that mostly are based on machine learning. So this is why this is important. Then a recent concern has been the presence of discriminatory bias in this kind of models. We have seen this kind of bias in other machine learning models or other mathematical models. For example, a very known case is the ProPublica system that is used in the judiciary system in the United States, and this has been shown that to have some discriminatory biases against Black people, especially. So in our case, treating unfair biases is beneficial not only to historically marginalized people, but also in this case to the loaner. It can help them. It can help them mitigate reputational risk, for example. It can help them improve the quality of their credit portfolio. Even there are some places where some laws and regulations already are in place in order to mitigate against this kind of discriminatory practices. In particular, here we are interested basically because I am from Costa Rica and from Latin America, and so we are some studies have shown that Latin America is one of the most important regions that contributes to this kind of biases. For example, there was a report in 2014 by Goldman Sachs in which they reported a global gap of $287 million between the small and medium companies owned by men and small and medium companies owned by women. And furthermore, other studies like one made by the Inter-American Development Bank have ascribed this kind of gaps in this access to credit to discriminatory practices in financial institutions. So some work has been done related especially to this kind of unfair treatment and unfair biases in mathematical models. For example, here, the first one that I have here, done by Verman Lubin in 2018, they basically took or made a review of different kind of fairness definitions and fairness metrics that are used in the literature between 2012 and 2017. And they demonstrated their use using a very used data set known as the German credit data set. Then the second study here has to do with this kind of biases in the fields of big data analytics. These authors also researched many different areas in a very large scope. They included social sciences, law, bioethics, philosophy, and they found solutions including not only technological solutions, but also legal solutions or human solutions. Lastly, the third one I have here has to do with this kind of biases in data engineering and data management. And so these authors actually found some gaps in knowledge regarding the lack of understanding of where bias comes from, and the difficulties in applying this kind of techniques of bias mitigation techniques to real world scenarios. So our work differs from these ones in the fact that we are centering ourselves specifically on credit scoring models, and specifically on the problem of gender bias. Also, we try to answer especially some of the unanswered questions in this last study. So the objectives of this study was the main objective was to outline techniques to reduce or to at least measure the impact of gender bias in this type of credit scoring models. For all articles, we aim to know the type of credit scores that they used, the types of bias that they addressed, the metrics of fairness that they used to measure these discriminatory biases, the criteria that they use to select these metrics, as we are especially interested in the application of this kind of techniques, right? And also for the articles that actually mitigated bias, because remember, some articles only measured it, only other articles actually applied some technique to mitigate the bias. So for these articles, we also are interested in knowing the kind of mitigation techniques that they used, the criteria they used to select these techniques, the requirements of each technique, the upsides and downsides of each of them. And well, we were interested in case studies and also experiments. So specifically for case studies that mitigated bias, we want to know what difficulties arose in practice. Now, I can tell you from now that we actually did not find any case studies that actually mitigated bias. So this last question remained unanswered. So in order to understand the results, I'm going to start explaining a little bit about some concepts that we need to know. So basically, credit scores, the modern stages of the loaning process, well, they differ depending on which author you read. But this is just an example of one way to decompose the loaning process. So basically, you can have a promotion stage in which the loaner promotes the services they have, then an evaluation stage in which they evaluate potential borrowers in order to determine if they will give them or not the loan, or under what conditions. During the approval stage, well, they approve this loan. Then in the disbursement stage, they give out the money, and the collection stage, the borrower must pay back their loan, right? So there are different types of credit scores depending on which of these stages we use them, and to which for which kind of decisions we need them, right? So, for example, the application score is used mostly in the evaluation phase in order to know if we are going to give a new potential borrower a loan or not. The collections is obviously used in the collection stage. This kind of credit score is used to evaluate what kind of strategy to use in order to collect collect the loan from different people. Bureau scores are used mainly by credit bureaus, which are mainly an indicator of bankruptcy. And behavioral and customer scores are pretty similar. These are mainly centered around customers that are already part of the institution, right? They already have some credit with their loaner. But they are they differ in the fact that behavioral scores mostly center on one credit operation, while customer scores integrate different operations for each customer. Regarding the types of bias, this is actually something that we are proposing ourselves, this classification here. So I'm gonna try to explain it a little bit in detail, try not to take a lot of time here. But we have identified three main sources where bias may come from. We can have bias coming from the training data. We can have biases introduced during the training of the model, or we can have biases that appear when using the model. So in training data, basically we can have disparate treatment, which is the most obvious kind of bias, which, for example, in this case, if we have women that we didn't give the credit to just because of the fact that they were women, well, this is disparate treatment. This is like a very direct kind of discrimination. Then we have association bias, in which we have two characteristics of of the borrower that that can be very highly correlated. For example, in this case, we can have the gender of the person and for example, the job they have, for example. And so a model may learn to discriminate based on, maybe the job, and maybe this is not considered a sensitive characteristic, but in this case, well, if it is associated with the gender, then it may be considered some kind of discriminatory bias, right? Then selection bias has to do with the way we select our data. So maybe we can have an unbalanced data set in which there are too little women. The amount of women is very small. And so the generalizations may not be completely valid. They may be discriminatory. And intentional bias is mentioned by some authors in which, for example, there are some exceptions made explicitly in the law. For example, in the United States, they have an explicit exception for the use that allows the use of age in this kind of credit models, even though it is also considered a protected attribute, a sensitive attribute. Then biases introduced by the model, the direct use of sensitive features and intentional bias. These are similar to disparate treatment and intentional bias in the first category. The difference here is that we are introducing them while training the model, right? We also have identified underestimation bias, which we do not let the model converge completely. And this can produce some kinds of bias. And also malicious bias, in which the person training the model might introduce these biases with malicious intentions. Finally, biases when using the model, we have identified automation bias, which is a kind of bias in which the person that uses the model might favor the criteria of the model over the criteria of a person, disregarding the accuracy of the model, right? Or vice versa. Now, regarding definitions of fairness, I'm not going to explain these ones in detail because these ones have been already presented in other papers before. I'm just going to talk about the main, the most macro categories here. Basically, we have these kinds of, the definitions of fairness are usually classified into three main categories, which are group fairness, in which basically we want to identify or we want to measure the difference in the distribution of the scores given to different groups. For example, in this case, we have men and women. We want to know how different is the distribution of their scores in each group. Individual fairness deals with how we treat each individual. So, for example, we need to know if an individual will get the same treatment regardless of their gender, for example, in this case. There are different approaches to this, and so this is why there are different subcategories here. And causal fairness is mostly based on the use of a causal graph that can be extracted sometimes from some kinds of models. And so this graph usually gives us a relation between the different attributes of an observation. In this case, a potential borrower. And so this kind of graph can give us, there are different ways of measuring how fair an algorithm is based on this graph. So this is how these different subcategories appear. We have also identified a fourth kind of fairness definition, which we have not been able to group in any of these three, which is process fairness, which is based a little bit more abstractly on the fairness that we have during the whole process of generating a model, right? Then bias mitigation techniques are usually classified in three main categories, depending on in which step of the process we apply them. So pre-processing techniques are usually applied directly over the data set before training. So we change the data set somehow in order to mitigate the bias, right? In processing techniques are usually used during the training. And so, for example, we can change the objective function of a model in order to make sure that it complies with some fairness definition. And finally, post-processing techniques are used when we already have a model that is biased, and we want to mitigate the bias in this model. So we apply some transformation on the data that enters, on the new data that enters this model that already has bias, in order to mitigate the possibility of getting a biased result. So for this literature review, we used the PRISMA methodology, the well-known PRISMA methodology. We explored three databases. We surveyed three databases: IEEE Explorer, ACM Digital Library, and Springer Link. And this is basically the search string that we used. Basically, as you can see here, we were interested in credit scoring, bias mitigation, and basically gender. We got, after the process, we finally got 20 articles that were reviewed. 19 of them were experiments, and one of them was a case study. As I mentioned before, this case study did not actually mitigate bias, they only measured it. So one of our questions remained unanswered. 13 of these articles reduced bias, the other 7 only measured it. Regarding the types of credit scores, well, we can see here that the most used type of credit score is the customer score. Again, this is interesting. An interesting finding is to see that not many authors seem to be very much aware of the different types of credit scores that there are, right? So we basically did this based on the descriptions they gave of each type of credit score or data set, or that the purpose of the credit score that they were studying. It is interesting to see that collection score, we did not find any articles that studied collection score, so this might be an interesting path to explore. Regarding our other questions, here we can see a relation of the types of bias that were used or that were addressed in each article, the fairness metrics that they used. As you can see, the most type of bias that was addressed was the bias in the training data set. This is usually the kind of bias that most people think about, as far as I can tell. So this makes sense. As you can see, the most amount of articles used a causal fairness metric to evaluate biases in the training data set. here we have to admit that there might be a little bias here, because there are four articles acquired by the same set of authors, so they were very related. So they tend to use the same metrics and the same type of bias. Interesting to see, not many people have investigated the part of using the model, type of biases when using the model. So this might be an interesting path to follow for further research. Regarding the selection criteria for these metrics, well, we can see we have many different criteria. The most used is legal requirements, which is, this makes it usually easier, because legal documents usually have a very, very well-defined set of requirements that the financial institutions must comply to. It's also interesting to see that process fairness did not actually cite a lot of, they don't really cite any selection criteria. But again, we only found like two articles regarding this kind of fairness. So we might need a bigger sample in order to find out what kind of criteria we could use to select this kind of fairness metric. Regarding the mitigation techniques, as you can see, most articles are centered around pre-processing techniques, and they use it to mitigate bias in the training data set, which makes a lot of sense, right? Because pre-processing takes into account the biases in the training data set, right? But as you can see here, it's interesting to see that there are also some techniques, some in-processing and post-processing techniques that are used to treat this kind of bias. In the other kinds of bias, well, it is pretty much expected that in-model biases will be treated using in-processing mitigation techniques, and biases when using the model might be treated using post-processing techniques. Finally, this figure has to do with the selection criteria for bias mitigation techniques. As we can see, they are all over the place. There is not a very strong criteria to select any of them. So finally, some conclusions that we draw from this are that, I think the most important one is that no article really treats bias, gender bias, differently from other types of bias. So this is a research path that is worth studying, because it hasn't really been studied before. It has just been presented as just another example of one type of bias that might be treated with different techniques, right? No article was found where a bias mitigation case study was done on a real implementation of a credit score. So this is also an important thing that could be researched. We could try to make more case studies where we try to implement this credit scores. Sorry, this mitigation techniques on credit scores. In order to learn a little bit more about what difficulties and what kind of things appeared when trying to use this kind of techniques on a real data set. We found also that, as I said before, no article addresses collection scores. Most measuring and mitigation techniques are centered on bias data set. Causal fairness metrics are the most used. And also, it's interesting that no articles address malicious or underestimation bias. So this is also a possible future work path. And well, as I said, legal requirements are the most often cited to justify the use of certain metrics. Also, it is interesting to see most articles address credit scoring as a binary classification problem. This is not really the case all the time when in real world in real-world credit scoring. Sometimes they use a multi-class classification problem, or sometimes it can even be addressed as a regression problem. So this might be also an interesting path to explore. So our main conclusions are, again, the most important finding: no articles focus specifically on the gender bias problem. So we aim specifically to keep researching this path. The main contributions of the article might be the classifications of the type of bias that I explained at the beginning, and the survey of criteria to select these techniques and metrics, which might be useful for a practitioner in order to apply these techniques and these kind of metrics. And for future work, we suggest the exploration of collection scores, making more case studies, as I mentioned before. Also further research into biases during training or during use of the model. As we said, most research is centered on the biases introduced by the data set. And also to consider the credit scoring problem as a multi-class or a regression problem. So this concludes my presentation for today.